Well, President Bush has admitted the intelligence he received on Iraq's WMDs turned out to be wrong pretty much, but was there still a case to be made for war? Now, the president says yes. Now, the Chicago Tribune has looked in detail at 9 of the president's arguments for war and weighs the evidence. Here to weigh in with his thoughts, Fox News military analyst, retired 4-star Army General Wesley Clark. He is a former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and a former presidential candidate. You got it all, General.
Thanks.
Based on what we now know, the president says, yes, we should have gone to war despite the WMD problem. What do you say?
Oh, I say no. Look, the real urgency behind this was that Saddam was supposedly going to develop a nuclear weapon that could threaten America. And that was what Vice President Cheney hyped. That's what Condi Rice hyped. And it simply wasn't borne out by the facts. Now, the rest of the arguments in there, the only other substantial argument was the connection with al-Qaeda. And the evidence has shown there, as the Chicago Tribune article admits, that there really wasn't any causative link. Saddam had nothing to do with al-Qaeda. Yes, there had been some intelligence contacts, relatively low level. Most of the governments in the Middle East probably had those contacts with someone from al-Qaeda. And the real push to go to war was the nuclear argument, and that nuclear argument was false.
Well, one thing that's pointed out not only by Chicago Tribune but also by the Dulfer report, which I'm sure you've read over, is that through the Oil for Food program, at which he was siphoning off billions of dollars for his own use, he was attempting to rebuild his arsenal, such as it was. If we had left him in power, do you have any fears that perhaps he might have ginned up a nuclear program?
I think what we would have had to do is continue to contain him, and we would have needed to sharpen up the instruments of containment. But
he wasn't letting in the inspectors, so that we didn't really know what he had, which is why we made some of our mistakes.
He did let in the inspectors under the threat, and we did have inspectors in there, and we could have continued to tighten the noose on Saddam. At the time, I recall, as you do, David, I'm sure people were saying, we can't keep 40,000 troops in Kuwait indefinitely. Well, what's going to happen to those troops in Kuwait? Well, now we've had 130,000, 140,000 troops for over 2 years in Iraq. So, in retrospect, we could have used military pressure to encircle Saddam, to have kept the inspectors in there, to have hobbled his ability to reconstruct his force, and we could have kept international support on our side and put much more effort against al-Qaeda.
Well, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but the question of inspectors is an important one. If he had, because he was drawing the line on certain aspects of the whole inspection issue, if he had thrown open the doors and said, inspectors, come on in, it would have been a different matter, but he didn't do that. Why do you think he was so reticent about letting the inspectors go in wherever they wanted to go?
Well, I don't presume to understand all of Saddam's motivation.
I don't blame you.
I'll tell you one thing that you have to do is you have to be able to get political power out of your military leverage. And we were doing that at the time. We did it in December and January of 2002, 2003. And in fact, if you read all of the writings about the administration's greatest fears were, hey, what if the inspection program just keeps going, and what if the inspectors don't find anything? Then how are we going to justify the invasion?
The 17 UN resolutions, etc.
And how are we going to then justify the invasion? So I think what happened is the administration kind of put the cart before the horse. They knew what remedy they wanted, and they started down a process that was okay, but then they had to sort of jump ahead in order to justify the invasion.
But how long should we have waited? I mean, it wasn't absolutely a sure thing, according to you, that we would have needed to go in, but how many more UN resolutions and how many more attempts to kick out inspectors would we have to have gone through?
It might take some time, but look, we spent over $200 billion there. We've had over 2,000 Americans die. We've got our armed forces deeply engaged. So what if we took 2 years? If there was no threat to the United States that we couldn't deal with, if there wasn't any way of, if there wasn't anything he could do to hurt us, why not keep him in the vice?
The problem is, of course, it's impossible to prove what could or could not have happened. There's no way of anybody saying that what he could have done under his cloaks that he had developed. But the final point I want to get to that the Chicago Tribune mentions is the spreading of a virus, if you will, in a positive sense, the virus of democracy. And as imperfect and all the problems that Iraq has, there is a development of a democracy of sorts there. And some people, even Wally Jumblatt, who's the the Lebanese, who was very skeptical about the Iraqi war at first, he said, and I think we can put it up there, he said, I was cynical about Iraq, but when I saw the Iraqi people voting, it was the start of a new Arab world. The Berlin Wall, he put it, has fallen. Do you agree with him?
Well, I think there's 2 points to be made here. First, we don't have to debate what Saddam could have done. We know, in fact, what the truth was, that he did not have the programs that were used to justify the U.S. invasion. So there was hype in it, and the invasion was, by the administration's logic, unnecessary.
But the falling, the so-called falling, if you will, of the Berlin Wall in the Arab world, has that happened in Iraq?
Well, you know, there have been voting and elections in the Arab world for a long time.
Well, yeah, but not anything like this. Not anywhere close, right?
We'll have to see what really happens, because what you have right now is a Shiite majority that, and as I wrote in my New York Times opinion piece back in early December, the real challenge is that Iran is coming in under the guise of democracy. We have to really continue to work this problem. Wouldn't it be a tragedy if under the guise of democracy we ended up with an Iranian theocratic state on the Persian Gulf that was allied with Iran, while Iran's trying to get nuclear weapons? So, you know, I'm all in favor of democracy. I think it's wonderful if we can achieve it, but it remains to be determined how effective we're going to be in achieving that.
Certainly a lot of things could go wrong, no question about it, but again, we don't want to ignore what goes right either. General Wesley Clark, we've got to leave it at that. Good to see you, sir. Thanks for coming in.
Great to be with you. Thanks.